On December 21st, 2024, one team of players made history in Final Fantasy XI. After 10.5 months of trying, they were the first in the world to clear the Oathsworn Blade Master Trial. This particular Master Trial, and everything that went into clearing it, has been one of the most significant achievements in Final Fantasy XI in many years. A lot has happened in the last 10 months, but if you want to know just how monumental this achievement is, you'll need to be brought up to speed. Oathsworn Blade came out on February 13th, 2024, and initially, this encounter looked pretty straightforward. This Master Trial has one objective, and that becomes immediately clear the minute you step into the fight. August is the only mob at the beginning, and you need to get his HP to 0. Seems simple enough, but this task took over 10 months of testing and strategizing before any team got the first clear. What made this fight so difficult? There are 4 hurdles players need to overcome to beat August. The first is that he has an enormous HP pool, meaning players need to be doing significant amounts of damage just to take him out in the hour allotted. This isn't a problem for well-geared players though, but this issue of a colossal pool of hit points was compounded by every other hurdle in this fight. The second massive hurdle was that he frequently used an attack called Null Field. This attack is an AoE that removes up to 3 random buffs from anyone hit by it. Because of his HP pool, along with his evasion, buffs are unsurprisingly essential for the damage dealers, and August used Null Field frequently enough to render all melee-centered damage-dealing strategies that were attempted completely unviable. This forced groups towards a ranged damage-dealing strategy, reducing the amount of damage they could dish out substantially. Now, just these hurdles alone are already relatively challenging, but trust me, this fight has not even begun yet. The fight progresses as normal until August loses 10% of his hit points. At this point, an ad spawns, and players must now deal with the third hurdle. It's a random Naakual among the 6 Naakuals fought in the Wildskeeper Reaves, and the versions of the Naakuals in this Master Trial are far more powerful than their corresponding versions even among the V25 Odyssey NMs. That is to say that if this ad isn't approached properly, it could end the run as easily as August himself. As if this wasn't enough, while the Naakual is alive, August gets a 99% damage taken reduction and a potent HP regen, healing him significantly with each tick. So even if sleeping the Naakuals was possible, it wouldn't help players to get through the fight, because as long as it's alive, August continues to heal and players can't do damage to him. Now you might think to take out the Naakuals as quickly as possible, but there's a problem. The Naakual spawns in with a 3.5 minute unremovable aura. This aura grants the Naakuals a 25% damage taken reduction, in addition to another crazy buff or ability, depending on the Naakual that spawned in. This makes the Naakual practically impossible to quickly kill. So while you try to survive the Naakual's attack and deal with the aura, August is invincible and regenerates HP. To top all of this off, once the Naakual is defeated, August uses a powerful move called Daybreak. This attack grants him a damage boost that lasts the duration that the Naakual you just killed was alive. August's damage buff ends with one of his most powerful attacks called No Quarter, a split damage move. This means that everyone needs to be in good enough health coming out of his buffed stance to survive this attack. Now keep in mind, just what we've discussed so far may be enough to set this encounter to be the most difficult encounter in the game, but all of this is only the first 2 phases of this 9-phase fight. Once August loses another 10% of his HP, another random Naakual, different from the one you already defeated, will spawn in. The party must survive and fight through the duration of this new Naakual's aura, while August becomes invincible and heals all over again. And just like the first time, upon the Naakual's defeat, August gains a damage buff and prepares his most powerful attack. The party must do this for all 6 Wildskeeper Naakuals at each 10% increment of August's health. Additionally, each Naakual spawns in at 1 level higher than the previous Naakual you defeated, and its aura will last 30 seconds longer. This means that the last Wildskeeper Naakual to spawn in will be 5 levels higher than the first, and its aura will last a full 2.5 minutes longer. It's important to note, no single strategy can deal with all of the variants this randomized spawn order results in. There were certain Naakuals that, if they spawned in later in the fight, with higher levels and a longer aura, There were simply no strategies for dealing with them. Furthermore, the lower August's HP is when the Naakual spawns in, the more HP he'll recover while you fight the Naakual due to its higher stats. The last Wild's Keeper Naakual spawns in at 40% of August's HP. It will also be the strongest. Now that we've come this far, I need to point something out. A tiny fraction of all of those who've attempted this fight were ever able to deal with all of the Naakuals fast enough to deplete August's remaining HP in the allotted time. This proved to be so difficult that the team who won the Master Trial progged the fight for 2 whole months before they ever made it past this phase. Eventually, after much hard work and determination, players got through this third hurdle. This was an achievement in its own right, but there was still the fourth and final hurdle players had yet to run into, one that proved to change the nature of this fight entirely. After 2 grueling months of studying this fight and putting together strategies for the Naakuals in different spawn orders, players were able to successfully get August down to 30% HP. Once he got to 30%, the 7th, final, and most powerful Naakual joined the fight, Teodor. Teodor doesn't behave like the other Naakuals. For starters, August doesn't gain DT or regen while Teodor is alive, so players are free to damage August. This proved to be negligible, however, because once August hits 1% of his health, he will not die until Teodor dies first. So what was Teodor like to fight? Teodor has a decent amount of hit points in his own right. This is made worse by the fact that he spawns in with dread spikes, meaning he steals HP from any player who tries to melee him. Furthermore, he cycles between several powerful auto attacks, the most notable of which is a long-ranged AoE. Now, none of this is particularly bad. Many of the Naakuals put up far more of a fight than this. But there is one thing about Teodor that broke all semblance of progress for every single group around the world trying to get the first clear. Teodor's aura lasted much longer than any Naakual before him, clocking in at 6.5 minutes. This aura is also by far the most punishing aura in the encounter. In addition to giving him the dread spikes already mentioned, it lowers the evasion of all players within range. The last effect Teodor's aura grants is it causes all of his attacks to inflict doom on the target. This means that, given the decreased evasion and the long-ranged AoE, there is no way for a player to avoid Teodor's aura. All of the players hit by Teodor would die in 30 seconds. Teodor in a 6.5 minute aura was never seen for the first couple months of this Master Trial, but as soon as players reached him, it changed the encounter completely. Now, no matter what players did, no matter what strategies were employed, the moment Teodor spawned in, every single player on the team would be dead within a couple minutes. Despite extensive testing and discussion, no method of proccing the aura or removing the doom status effect were found, and believe me, this wasn't for lack of trying. Several full days of intense testing later, Bigtymer, one of the very players who was first to clear the Crystal Paradise, reached out to Square Enix on the official forums, stating that there must be an error in the fight. There were simply no means, methods, or mechanics that would allow a group of even the most prepared players to survive Teodor's onslaught for more than a couple minutes, let alone the whole 6.5 minute duration. Rather than directly responding to this forum post, the post was placed under a different thread called Working as Intended. This was Square Enix's way of saying that this fight, a fight that dwarfs every other encounter currently in the game, a fight whose real challenge players hadn't even begun to understand after 2 months of intense progging. This same fight has no issues, and it's perfectly clearable with the proper strategy. And with that, all semblance of progress on this encounter came to a screeching halt. No substantial discoveries were made regarding Teodor for days, for weeks, for months. Some of the very most dedicated players who had persevered through earlier phases of the fight threw in the towel, and the growing consensus among many players observing the fight was that the fight very well may not be possible with the current gear available in the game. This wouldn't be the first time Square Enix released a fight that was practically broken, but a little while later, on May 13th, 2024, the next Master Trial was released. This split the community's focus on Oathsworn Blade for some time, but it was clear that many players hadn't the heart to move on from this fight until every possible strategy was tested. Just after midnight on December 21st of 2024, a full 8 months after Teodor had started the roadblock, 2 players took to the forums to confirm the world-first clear of Oathsworn Blade. So how did these players do it? How are these players able to overcome the monumental challenge that Teodor posed? The strategy they came up with to defeat Teodor is one of the most brilliant expressions of creative problem solving that I've seen in a video game. Before explaining the strategy, we need to go over 3 particular behaviors or mechanics of Teodor that clued the team into the fact that this strategy may be possible. The first thing to know about Teodor is that players can control where he spawns, as he will always spawn in the same spot that the last Naakual died. The second thing is that Teodor doesn't spawn with shared enmity as August. He will only ever attack the first person that pulls him, or until he goes from walking to running. And that is the third thing about Teodor. While he's walking, he can be pulled by any player, but once he starts running, this means that he links with August and will attack whoever August is attacking. And if Teodor spawned at the edge of the combat arena, he walks for longer than if he spawned in the center. Now, to a non-professional player such as myself, these pieces of information seem completely useless. What good will Teodor's strange spawn and aggro behavior do if as soon as he goes from walking to running, the tank will be dead in 30 seconds? As I mentioned before, however, this was all the team needed to know to put together the winning strategy. For the sake of this video, I'm going to name this strategy that I had no part in devising, the Link Threshold strategy. I know I have no right to be naming something like this, so I apologize if this rubs anyone on the team the wrong way. But here is how the strategy worked. They discovered that Teodor would always go from walking to running at the center of the arena, a spot someone on the team called the Link Threshold, which is where I got the name. As long as Teodor never reached the Link Threshold, his enmity could be controlled, so the team split up into 2 different groups of 3. The tank and the 2 damage dealers in the furthest corner of one side of the arena, keeping August as far away from the Link Threshold as possible, and the second group was composed of the healers and the 2 supporters, keeping Teodor on the opposite side of the arena. For the entire 6.5 minute duration, the tank had to tend to himself, self-healing and doing anything else he needed to do to keep August from killing him while the healer and support were occupied. On the opposite side of the arena, the second group employed a zombie strategy to keep Teodor from ever reaching the Link Threshold and attacking the tank. The members of the second group took turns tagging Teodor, pulling him as far away from the Link Threshold as possible, and surviving as long as they could. Once that player died, the next player in the line would allow Teodor to slowly walk towards the Link Threshold in order to wait out as much time as possible, and then proceed to tag him and repeat the process. All 3 members of the second group rotated this responsibility for the entire duration of Teodor's aura. Now, one important thing to note is that once Teodor's aura is gone, he doesn't pose that much of a threat, but because of how lengthy the aura is, the damage dealers had to wait a full 6.5 minutes before even attacking him, eating away precious minutes on the clock. When Teodor dies, August gets fully regenerated back to 30% HP, so the damage dealers have very little to do while Teodor's aura is up. But as soon as it's gone, they have to plow through all of Teodor's HP as well as the 30% of August's HP in the time they have left. August uses full quarter at every 10% increment of his remaining HP, and he stays in the buffed Daybreak stance, putting more load on the healer and support. If the damage dealers are able to execute perfectly and dish out all of the damage required in the remaining time, then the team claims victory, which is exactly what one particular team did on December 21st.
fucking go, baby! Yeah!
After 10 and a half grueling months of failure and defeat, this team was the first to clear Oathsworn Blade. The players of this group were Shiraj, playing an M-level 47 Rune Fencer sub-Blue Mage, Bigtymer, playing an M-level 50 Ranger sub-Dragoon, Mopar, playing an M-level 45 Ranger sub-Dragoon as well, Nefertarii, playing an M-level 50 Geomancer sub-White Mage, Bakerboy, playing an M-level 50 Bard sub-Scholar, Snukums, playing an M-level 50 Corsair sub-Ninja, and also Saviorself, who may not have been part of the party at the time of the clear, but was instrumental throughout the prog. A huge congratulations to everyone in the group for being the first in the world to clear the Oathsworn Blade Master Trial. How did you and others deal with certain bottlenecks that popped up in the fight?
Yeah, I think, I can't speak for the whole team on this one, but, and I know at a minimum our tank would probably disagree with me on this one, which I don't blame him for, as I would certainly have zero interest in tanking that fight. For me personally, I felt like the prog on this fight was really enjoyable for a few different reasons. One of those reasons was kind of related to the smoothness of progression. So I think back to probably about 2 weeks into prog, so a couple weeks after the fight came out. At that point, we had just had our personal best pull, which was getting to 60% and seeing the fourth ad. We had timed out on that pull, didn't actually kill the fourth ad, but we had at least seen him. I remember having kind of a conversation with the team at the time of, we certainly felt like we could squeeze out a little bit more damage to be able to kill that fourth ad. But I distinctly remember having conversations of, okay, well, do we feel like it's possible for us to then push August back down to 50% to see the fifth ad as sort of like the next milestone? Because at the time we, had, 2 weeks to sort of fine tune some of our buff choices and start to do some of the small optimizations that's required to push more damage. It certainly felt like completely out of reach to see, for example, the sixth ad. That felt impossible. If we had a crystal ball back then, and if someone had told us, no, the fight sequence is exactly what you think it is, where it's August all the way down to 0%, and all along the way, every 10% is an ad, the last ad being Teodor, and then you have to finish off August. And also, by the way, because of the way that you have to deal with Teodor, you have to basically kill 6.5 minutes off the clock where you're doing 0 damage. If you had told us that at the time, I think we may have lost motivation in doing the fight, because that would have seemed like an absolute insurmountable thing to do. I guess in a way, ignorance was bliss. So kind of throughout the process, I remember having conversations with the team about, well, maybe something happens at 50%, 50. Maybe August transforms into Teodor, and Teodor has significantly less HP than August does, and then it's just a matter of finishing off Teodor, and then the fight ends. Or maybe after you kill the sixth Naakual, the fight ends, or something like that. So we kind of had these naive, wishful hopes simply because it felt so out of reach to find all the extra damage that would be required to take August all the way down to 0%, which is kind of funny to look back on. And then, in addition to that, so really what kind of kept us motivated was these interim milestones that we kept setting. It was the first one being, okay, let's push to kill the fourth ad. And then it was, all right, let's push to see the fifth ad, and then kill the fifth ad, and then push to see the sixth ad, etc., all the way down. So, obviously the kill pull was certainly the sweetest moment where, we kind of accomplished something that we at one point thought was impossible. But really throughout all of progression, certainly on the first segment of progression, which was working on the first 6 Naakuals, and progression on Teodor was kind of its own beast that I'm sure we'll talk about later. But certainly within that first segment, working on the first 43, 45 minutes of the fight, it felt really smooth and rewarding simply because we kind of had this series of incremental small steps in progression, but we were kind of at the point over the first couple of months of prog where we were pretty regularly hitting the new milestone that we were setting for ourselves. So pretty regularly hitting these personal bests that we once thought at one point previously were impossible to hit, and we kept hitting them. So it was rewarding in that sense, I would say, at least for those first 2.5 months before we got to Teodor.
Speaking of Teodor, which that leads directly into my next question,
Mm-hmm.
as soon as anyone hit Teodor, which was about 2 months into the prog, it felt like all progress just completely hit a roadblock. Does that sound about right? And the next question essentially is, what was the biggest challenge in the fight, which I assume was Teodor. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, he would certainly be the biggest challenge. So we had seen Teodor for the first time at the end of April, so it was about 2.5 months it took us to see him. And then obviously the kill came in 8 months after that. So yeah, for the majority of time, it was kind of Teodor that was the big wall. Yeah, as far as we know, I wasn't aware of this other Japanese group that it sounds like from your Google Translate they had maybe seen Teodor. I wasn't aware of that, but yeah, certainly for a long time, as far as we knew, we were the only group to have seen Teodor, and it does require a pretty colossal effort to even get a Teodor pull in. The first time we had seen Teodor, we had maybe less than a minute on the instance timer left.
Wow.
And to get to him for that first time, I think we got a wild card reset and like good RNG in terms of the ad spawn order that was happening, and just everything was going our way to even be able to see him for that first time. In the subsequent few times that we saw him, I think we maybe had like 5 minutes left on the clock, which was very different than our kill pull, which I can talk about. But so we kind of got to the point where probably the second, third, fourth time we saw him, the cadence at which we were seeing him was probably once every 5 hours of doing pulls. So we might see him once a night when we were doing pulls. In addition to that, you basically, because of how he works, you kind of have a list of things that you want to test on him, because when you're kind of going through it for the first time, there's no known strategy for dealing with him. So you're kind of theorizing things to test for dealing with him. When you finally get to him after doing 5 hours of pulls on a night, you're finally having a really good pull where everything's going your way, you're executing correctly, you might have some good RNG going your way, and you're 55 plus minutes into the pull, you finally get to him. You have exactly 30 seconds to test whatever it is that you want to test on him.
That's crazy.
And after those 30 seconds, the tank will die from the doom. After that, everything kind of, chaos ensues. So that's kind of the challenge. Is it was very expensive to get to him and test ideas. It would have been a completely different story if he was also in the random ad order spawn rotation, where perhaps if luck went your way, you could see him first. It would have been a completely different story, but because of how much of an effort it takes to get to him, and then you only have 30 seconds to test stuff, that was kind of the big challenge, and that was the big reason why it took so long, because we certainly had a long list of ideas to try out on him. The ideas are almost endless. I mean, especially when you consider the fact that, the same devs that made this fight are the same devs that thought it would be a good idea to add in that mechanic that we see with the Swordy G basement boss, where, it's cast Dia 50 plus times on him or whatever. I mean, when you bear that in mind, that it's the same dev team, it could be almost anything, cast 25 holies on Teodor and that'll take his aura off. I mean, the list of possibilities is endless, but because of how costly it is to get to him and test some of these ideas, you really have to be selective in the ideas that you decide that are worth spending the time testing, because, the question that we had to ask with each idea that we were considering was, this idea seems maybe plausible. Do we feel like it holds enough water to where we're all willing to spend 5 hours of time and effort into testing for 30 seconds?
Wow.
And so that was kind of the question that you had to ask with each idea. That was a big part of the reason why it took so long for us to figure out Teodor. He was, all the other ads are difficult to deal with them execution wise, but there's not really much of a mechanical puzzle with those. They're just difficult execution wise. With Teodor, he's kind of the opposite. Frankly, once you know a winnable strategy for Teodor, execution wise, I think he's, it's pretty easy to execute that strategy. The challenge with Teodor was the puzzle aspect of it, was being, kind of the first ones to figure out how to appropriately deal with him.
Man, that's incredible. So, speaking of the Oathsworn Blade Master Trial, the structure of this particular encounter, if, let's say tomorrow, someone found how to proc every single aura for all of the ads, how would the difficulty of this fight compare to Crystal Paradise?
It would probably put it on the same level, if not maybe even slightly easier than Crystal Paradise. certainly it would make Teodor a joke, and just by virtue of that alone, you would immediately save 6.5 minutes on the timer, because I'm assuming probably not everyone listening to this is familiar with our strategy, but our strategy basically involves killing off 6.5 minutes on the clock for us to be able to deal with Teodor, where we're doing 0 damage. So if you could avoid the aura altogether in Teodor, just on him alone, you would save 6.5 minutes on the timer. And then in addition to that, some of the worst ads, specifically the B, is probably worth calling out. A big part of the reason why the B is arguably the worst ad, the most annoying one to deal with, and takes the longest, is because of its aura. It has a blink aura, and the later on in the spawn order the B is, the more potent that blink aura becomes. Which means if you get a bad ad order, which might involve a B spawning, 4th, 5th, or 6th, we might be looking at a 4.5 or 5 minute kill on the B, which is actually extremely costly from a DPS output perspective, because not only are you taking longer to kill the B, but at the same time, while the Naakuals are out, August has a very, very potent regen. So a big win condition in terms of meeting the DPS check that's required in this encounter is blowing up the ads as fast as possible, because any damage that you're dealing to the ads is essentially doing double duty, because you're basically giving August less time to tick up from the regen from the Naakual ads.
So, from most ads, how much HP did August usually recover by the time you guys were able to clear them?
Yeah, it's certainly dependent on the ad. I would say we on our kill pool, our ad kill pace was probably averaging about 3 minutes. So at that pace, I'd guesstimate that maybe he regen back up to probably 15% higher than where he was when we spawned the ad. 15 to 20%, something in that range.
That makes sense. Now that a lot of people kind of understand how difficult this fight is, or at least some of the core mechanics, could you walk us through the winning pool, what that was like, and everything that went into it?
Yeah. Do you want me to kind of recap the strategy, or talk specifically about the winning pool and how well things went, assuming everyone already knows the strategy?
Yeah, go ahead and recap that strategy.
Sure. Yeah, with the strategy, a lot of it's in the details, which is probably not worth hitting on now. But yeah, so basically, I guess the high level sequencing of the fight is, you start with August, and as you're working him down, every 10% he will spawn one of the Naakual ads, and it's a random Naakual that he spawns at each 10%. As we've already been talking about, while each Naakual ad is out, August gains a regen. He also gains a really potent DT, which is worth mentioning, that you really can't do any damage to August while the ad's out, so you have to kill the ad. The ads come out with an aura, and there's no known way to proc those auras. They do wear off over time, and so each ad kind of has its own. We came up with a separate strategy for dealing with each ad individually, and separate geo bubbles and all that, which people can probably see the details of that in the write-up. Once you kill each Naakual ad, August will use a move called Daybreak, where he'll put out his wings, and so he gets that visually, but also it gives him a pretty potent damage boost while he's got his wings out as well. After he uses Daybreak, that starts a countdown timer before he'll use No Quarter. So that countdown timer is dependent on how long it took you to kill the ad that triggered the Daybreak. So if it took you 4 minutes to kill an ad, once you kill that ad, he'll use Daybreak, and then exactly 4 minutes after Daybreak, he will pop No Quarter, which is basically just a split damage conal move that you have to be a little bit careful about the positioning on, because it's only a 15 yalm range on it, and so you want everyone close enough to be within range of being hit by that No Quarter, so you're appropriately splitting up the damage between all members. But at the same time, you don't want people too close to where they're getting hit by some of August's other TP moves while you're DPSing him down. So that's kind of... Oh yeah, yeah.
The Daybreak buff that he gets, does that last until he pops the No Quarter, or does it last a set amount of time?
It lasts until he pops the No Quarter, with the exception of the final push. So during this first Naakual part of the phase, or part of the fight, yes, it goes away. The wings go away and the damage boost goes away after he pops no quarter. In the final 30% push after you've killed Teodor, those wings stay out permanently, so he permanently has that damage boost.
Okay,
so he
wow.
operates a little bit differently post Teodor versus pre Teodor. That's kind of the first, I would say, 43-ish minutes of the fight is working your way through those Naakual ads. Then you spawn Teodor. The worst part about Teodor is the effect from his aura is an end doom effect on his auto attacks. And that was kind of the big hurdle and the big puzzle that we were trying to solve mechanically with it, because as far as we know, the doom that applies from the end doom on his autos is an unremovable doom. It cannot be taken off as far as we know.
And it lasts 30 seconds, is that right?
Yeah, it's a 30-second doom, unremovable doom. And he rotates through different auto attacks. He's got a melee auto attack, but one of his auto attacks is a ranged auto attack. It's 25 Yalm range, and it's also an AoE. And that AoE applies the end doom for anyone that gets hit by the AoE. Pretty brutal to deal with in any what you might think of traditional ways. The way that we were able to deal with that ultimately was to come up with what we've been calling like a zombie death rotation or cycle, where we basically have our tank who's holding hate on August take August to one side of the arena, and we have our Bard, Core, and Geo, which is sort of this zombie rotation team, initially tag Teodor and take him to the opposite side of the arena. You know, one of the details of this is you can actually control where Teodor spawns in the arena, so you can actually already spawn him. You can force spawn him to the opposite side of the arena, so that there's no risk of him immediately spawning in and within 2 seconds hitting your tank with an auto attack that dooms him. Yeah, someone in that zombie team initially tags Teodor, and then you begin this rotation of dying, surviving as long as possible. So at least like with those initial deaths on every person, you're basically able to live the full 30 seconds. So Teodor will hit, each person initially with the end doom. That begins the 30-second doom counter. And at least with those initial deaths, while you're not weakened, and, the Bard and the Geo are able to cure themselves, and the Core is able to, kind of try and maintain shadows as best as possible. Those three players can last pretty much the full 30 seconds. And then right there alone, that kills off a minute and a half, because the goal is Teodor's aura wears off naturally after 6.5 minutes after he spawns. So the concept behind the strategy is you're basically trying to preoccupy Teodor for 6.5 minutes until his aura wears off. And then once the aura wears off, you can begin damage on him again. Each time someone dies, we kind of had a set rotation among those three players that, after the Core would die, then the Bard would tag Teodor once he gets close to the center, because when he dies, kind of a key part of this is he doesn't spawn with shared hate on August. So our tank is not immediately on the enmity list of Teodor, which is really what makes this possible. Because once Teodor has aggro on someone, his movement speed is very, very quick. So if he had aggro on the tank initially after spawning via shared hate with August, this whole strategy just wouldn't work, because he would kill one person in the death cycle and then immediately sprint toward the tank. And so what happens instead is when someone dies in the death cycle, he will slowly walk back to the center of the arena, and basically reset. Once he hits the center of the arena and resets, he will then at that point link to August and full sprint toward the tank. So the idea is that this zombie team is trying to prevent him from ever hitting the center of the arena. One challenge with that is one of his auto attacks is ranged. He can use back-to-back ranged auto attacks, and when the zombie team is double weakened, you're basically getting one shot from it. Any auto attack is going to one shot you when they're kind of at the point of being double weakened. So there can be some RNG with the effort of zombie jungling. If you get back-to-back ranged autos that one shot, two of the people in the cycle, hopefully that third person is re-raised back up by then and able to attack him quickly. And hopefully that next auto, that third one, is not also a back-to-back-to-back ranged auto. Otherwise, the run's probably over. So yeah, you basically kind of keep that up for 6.5 minutes. We used an item, a re-raise item called the Scapegoat, which I think is actually a really important part. If that item didn't exist, I'm not sure this strategy would be doable. Yeah, it's an item that, is basically instant use, and you don't have like a lockout period where you're sort of like animation locked after, like you have with some items, which is really important because, there's moments where you have to re-raise, immediately pop the Scapegoat, and immediately tag him after you pop the Scapegoat because perhaps the other two people died quickly from a ranged auto or something like that. So there are some sketchy moments during the juggling process, and there's a bit of RNG to it as well. But then, yeah, once his aura wears off, you can basically let Teodor leash back to the center, start attacking the tank, and then the zombie team re-raises back up, and we continue damage on Teodor. And really, once his aura wears off, Teodor is really not bad to deal with. I mean, he's maybe arguably the easiest of the ad in terms of execution. He just takes a while simply because you have 6.5 minutes where you can't do anything on him. And then after that, once you're actually able to start up damage on him, it takes maybe 3.5 minutes from there to kill him.
While Teodor is alive, what's going on with August exactly?
With August, the tank is just holding August off, on the opposite side of the arena, and the tank is basically just self-sustaining themselves, healing themselves. We ran a Rune Fencer, sub Blue Mage, so, and especially without the Rangers shooting August and feeding him TP, it's really a non-issue for the tank to keep themselves alive. It's probably worth noting that they programmed Teodor a little bit different and how he interacts with August and the other ads. So while Teodor is out, unlike the other ads in the fight, August doesn't have any DT and he doesn't have any regen. So you can actually keep damaging August, but it turns out you can only take him down to 1%. He will not die. And that was actually kind of the fact that he operates differently than the other ads in that way. That actually kind of baited us into taking an incorrect approach in a previous poll. So probably about a week before our kill poll, I think the prior weekend, we had a really good poll that could have been a clear poll, but we didn't have that piece of info. This is kind of part of the downside of being the first to go through this. You don't really know how things are going to play out. We assumed, well, maybe we can just kill August. Maybe the Rangers can kill August while the zombie team is doing the juggling. Because we were under that presumption on that poll, we had a Soul Voice ready to go because of a decent cutting cards. So before Teodor spawned, we actually had the Bard rip that Soul Voice and put up a fresh 10-minute set of full Soul Voice 5 songs on the Rangers, so that the Rangers can chunk down August and hopefully kill him while the zombie juggling is going on with Teodor. Come to find out on that poll that August starts taking 0 damage once he hits 1%, and then once you kill Teodor, August will restore back up to 30%, which was pretty disheartening.
Wow.
Because had we known that, we would have saved that Soul Voice until after Teodor died, and we probably would have then killed it on that poll. But by the time the zombie juggling was done, and by the time we killed Teodor, the Soul Voice and got back onto August and had to push him down that 30% that he restored. By that time, the Soul Voice songs had already worn off, and we only had probably 5 minutes left on the instance timer. So without Soul Voice songs, you can't chunk August down 30% in 5 minutes. It just wasn't doable. So had we known that piece of information, we probably would have killed it a week earlier.
After you kill Teodor, August's HP resets to 30. What happens after that? What's the last phase of the fight like?
Yeah, so at that point, he pops Daybreak, just like he does when all the other ads die. But this one is a little bit different, not in a meaningful way, but it's important to know that he, for the rest of the fight, will keep the wings out and he'll keep that damage bonus. But at that point, the tank doesn't have to self-sustain themselves. The Bard and the Geo are back to being available to cure the tank. So the damage boost aspect for the rest of the fight is not that big of a deal. It gets a little bit rough and stressful because the two healers at that point are double weakened, so their cooldowns are terrible. Their mana situation is terrible, and he's got a pretty potent damage boost from the wings, but it's manageable. So those wings stay out for the rest of the fight, and then the other aspect of it is that the no quarter operates a little bit differently than it did with the previous ads. It's not on a fixed timer that is dependent on how long Teodor took to kill. It's actually from there on out just based on August's percentage. No quarter's at 20, no quarter at 10%, and even after that second no quarter, he'll still maintain the wings for the last 10%.
Do you think the structure of this Master Trial has made it the most difficult of the Master Trials to prog so far? Because, again, I'm not too familiar with some of the history of the older Master Trials, but I don't recall any of the other ones being split up in phases where it keeps players from testing everything, right off the beginning.
I think it's definitely up there. I think it has been the most difficult one. I have progged all of them on release except for, I believe, Unafraid of the Dark. Technically, I think you can make an argument that maybe Sealed Fate was slightly harder simply because I believe, if memory serves, I think Sealed Fate was basically viewed as impossible. Pretty quickly, Square Enix went in and nerfed it. I think the magic evasion in Sealed Fate was just so high that it was basically deemed impossible. Whereas this one, they had put a nerf in, I think, a few months after release on Oathsworn Blade, but we found it to be extremely minimal. It was a barely noticeable evasion nerf that they put in. That when we first saw the patch notes on it, we were hopeful. Well, maybe this might allow us to play around with our buff choices a little bit. Maybe we don't have to run 2 preludes the whole fight. At least maybe while Soul Voice is up. Or maybe it'll mean that the Corsair has an easier time hitting. Or maybe we don't have to run precision when Soul Voice is down. If it was meaningful enough, we probably could have tweaked up our buff choices, and that would have added a meaningful amount of damage throughout the fight. But yeah, unfortunately, it wasn't. It was kind of a nothing nerf. In the case of Sealed Fate, who knows whether or not it would have been beaten if they just left it untouched for 10 months? I don't know. But yeah, I think other than that magic evasion piece in Sealed Fate, yeah, to me, I think the difficulty of this one has probably been the highest. Now, we do have another one that's out that still has not been beaten. At some point, we'll probably revisit that one. We had spent some time progging it, which I guess was also maybe part of the reason why it took us 10.5 months on Oathsworn Blade, because we took probably like a month break from Oathsworn Blade to work on the Chaos and Bahamut Master Trial. I guess time will tell on that one. We haven't fully exhausted our ideas on that one yet, so it's hard to say if that one is more difficult than this one, but at least among the Master Trials that have been cleared and have a known winnable strategy, Oathsworn Blade to me feels like the toughest, both from a DPS check perspective as well as just a survivability perspective, because the reality of it is as we were initially progging and sort of fine-tuning our party composition, at one point, maybe very early on in prog, we were running with a white mage, and then we realized we need to find more damage. So instead, maybe we run with a red mage instead of the white mage, which is a step in the direction of having a more aggressive party comp, adding to the damage output potential, but also providing less safety. And then at a certain point in prog, we realized, well, we need even more damage. So drop the red mage altogether and add in a second ranger. And that was sort of, as aggressive as you could kind of possibly get, at least in the way of main jobs party composition goes. But the more aggressive that you get with the party composition, the more demanding it is on the healers, on the Geo and the Bard, who are now being asked to do a lot in the way of keeping people alive. So yeah, from a survivability standpoint and from a damage output standpoint, to me, this one has been the most difficult. Even on our clear pull, our kill pull was really kind of a god tier pull in terms of the RNG aspects of the fight. I mean, execution wise, the kill pull was, we played really well that pull. In addition to that, almost everything you can imagine RNG wise went our way. The ad spawn order is super and super important. I mean, if you get if you get a bad spawn order, even if everything else lines up your way, if you get a good wild card reset, if you get a good cutting cards, etc., it would probably be pretty tough to imagine a kill pull happening if you get a bad spawn order. We had a really good spawn order on that kill pull, almost perfect. And then in addition to that, we got the wild card reset to hit, and we got a very good cutting cards for an extra soul voice at the very end after Teodor for the final 30% push on August. So everything went our way. I'm really not sure. We had a conversation afterward of if the wild card hadn't hit and if the cutting cards wasn't, it was like a 1 or a 2, do we think we would have killed on that pull even with the best possible or almost the best possible ad order? And our consensus was it probably would have been really close. We're not sure. It would have been extremely tight though if it was a kill pull.
Talking about the difficulty of this fight, this is one conversation that I've had with some people so far. Do you really think that this was the intended strategy for this fight, the way you guys have it set up? In my script, I have it written as the link threshold strategy, but the idea of separating the two and having a team tag Teodor continually till the aura runs out. Do you think that's what the developers had in mind, or do you think they even had kind of a win condition strategy for players in mind when designing the fight?
I think almost certainly not. We'll never know what their intent was, but it's hard to imagine that they ever would have intended this sort of like zombie strategy. In fact, I think there's maybe good reason to think that sort of in the positive way, not just trying to assume that this wasn't their intention. Historically, this idea of zombieing a mob is not completely novel in this game. I mean, that is something that's been employed previously, like throughout the game's entire history. From what we saw, though, it seems like Square Enix has kind of learned and have caught on to this. So traditionally, the way that zombie techniques have been employed is, if the entire party dies, then one person can re-raise back up, tag the boss with some sort of dot, let's say Dia, so that dot will stay on him, and then that person will probably die quickly. But if they got re-raise up before they applied the dot, then they can re-raise back up, and then at some point before the dot wears off, you can reapply it, and then die again. And the whole purpose of doing that is so that the mob doesn't completely reset, because once they completely reset, then they start regenning back up basically 10% every tick, and the fight's over at that point. So you would basically do that to prevent the mob from full resetting and gaining a super potent regen. They thought of that with this fight, though. On this particular fight, you can't do that sort of traditional zombie technique because the moment, in this instance, the moment when everyone dies in the encounter, August full cleanses himself of all debuffs. Not sure if that was the reason they programmed August to full cleanse himself when everyone dies to prevent a zombie technique, but so this was kind of a slight modification to the traditional ways of doing zombieing. Where you still have the tank and the 2 rangers alive, so you don't have August at any point full cleanse himself and full reset.
One of the reasons I think it's interesting you feel that way about this fight in particular, one of the live streams that they had before releasing this fight, which I'm sure you might have seen it on the thread, but the producer was talking about how this fight was going to be significantly harder than, say, the Crystal Paradise. That was just through a translation. I don't speak any Japanese, again. That might have been a mistranslation. But I, after hearing that, am very skeptical that any procs will be found for the auras. So that makes sense for the zombie strategy anyway. Do you have any other ideas that would be able to deal with Teodor other than, say, a zombie, this zombie strategy that you guys have?
We really don't. Yeah, that was we had actually taken probably at one point we probably took a 2-month break on working on the fight because I mentioned we had to be really selective with the ideas that we wanted to try on Teodor, and the reason we had kind of stopped progging the fight was because we kind of ran out of the what we would consider high plausible ideas that were worth spending 5 hours of time on. We still certainly had other ideas, but weren't, we didn't feel too good about those ideas. Yeah, it's hard. It's definitely hard to imagine what the intended way was for dealing with him. I mean, one idea which actually ultimately led to us having the idea for what turned out to be the winning strategy was when we came back to progging Teodor after that couple month break. One idea that we had, maybe instead of being able to proc Teodor's aura off, maybe there might be a way, based on what you do earlier in the fight, to prevent Teodor from spawning in with an aura altogether. The idea that we wanted to try for that, and I guess from a design standpoint, the reason that we thought that might be a little bit more plausible than, some method for proccing Teodor after he spawns, is simply because when he spawns in, he spawns with that aura, and within 2 seconds, he'll hit your tank with an auto attack and apply an unremovable doom. So unless you could proc him, if it was a proc system on Teodor, unless you can proc him almost instantly within those first 2 seconds, your tank is going to die. So that's kind of why we're thinking, well, maybe the intended way involves preventing him from spawning in with his aura altogether. So the idea that we had for that was, maybe we need to kill all 6 Naakuals before him while they have their auras up. So kill them all before their auras wear off over time. We tried that, and actually on the pull that we had where we were able to test that, we killed them all during the window of their auras, all 6 Naakuals, and then we pushed August down to spawn Teodor. Unfortunately, he spawned with his aura up still, so we found out that didn't work. But on that pull, we had noticed something weird with Teodor's enmity. The tank died, chaos ensued, everyone started to spread out. At one point, the tank was dead, so there's 5 people left. One of our members went to the one side of the arena, and then all the other 4 players went to the other side and ended up dying there. But we had noticed once all 4 of the other players died, August full sprinted to this other player on the opposite side of the arena. But we observed that Teodor was kind of slowly walking back to the center, which we thought was weird. So that kind of sparked these ideas of, well, can we replicate that somehow? What caused that? Is it possible to reproduce in a consistent way? So that was, it was kind of on that pull, which was what we thought was the last plausible idea that we had that we thought was worth testing. Fortunately, on that pull, we had noticed this weird thing with Teodor slowly leashing back to the center. Wow. And that is really kind of what gave us some ideas, and we started reviewing all the VODs that we had of Teodor and started brainstorming this, what ultimately turned into this zombie strat idea.
Like I say, man, huge congratulations on this. I'm hoping to be able to talk to you again once you guys clear Wing of War. We'll see how the prog for that winds up going.
Yeah, fingers crossed. We'll see. I think we're going to take a little bit of a break here. I think we've been chatting, and we feel like we deserve a little bit of a break before we dive into the next one.
Thank you so much for coming on here, man.
Yeah, appreciate it, man. Yeah, thanks for bringing attention to it. Definitely appreciate it.